Welcome, everybody, to the May Lunch with NEMA. My name is Heather Riggs. I'm with the New England Museum Association. And just to make sure that you guys can all hear me, in the chat feature, do you guys mind listing where you're calling from so we can actually know who's on the call with us today? And as you guys are starting there, get you familiar with the chat. This is how you're actually going to be interacting with Jessica today. So if you guys have any questions at all at any time during the presentation, go ahead and type them in the chat feature, and I will interrupt Jessica. Or when we have time for questions, I will be asking all the questions for her, for you guys on there. Great. Looks like we're from all over. Okay, Jessica, so I would like you guys to introduce you to Jessica Bitely. She's the Director of Preservation Services at the Northeast Document Conservation Center. She was actually recently interviewed by Dan Yeager for our Museum People podcast. So if you guys haven't listened to that, after this, I would suggest going over to the NEMA website to actually listen to it. It's a really cool interview. So Jessica, I'm going to let you take it over.
Okay. Hello, everybody, and thank you so much for joining me on your lunch hour to talk about preservation. It's not always a hot topic for people, so I'm really glad that you were interested and decided to come. As Heather mentioned, I'm the Director of Preservation Services at the Northeast Document Conservation Center in Andover, Massachusetts, NEDCC. At NEDCC, we provide a wide variety of services, including conservation of bound volumes, photographs, negatives, works of art on paper, as well as imaging services, and in my department, we do a lot of education and outreach. So a lot of webinars. If you're interested in webinars, we do have our training schedule up with a number of new topics. You can find that on adcc.org. We also do workshops, and we perform preservation assessments for institutions probably very much like yours. And today I'm really, I'm actually going to talk you through performing a preservation assessment, kind of, fairly generally, but to give you a sense of what preservation actually is, because I think that there is sometimes some confusion about the scope of preservation. And with that, this is the scope of the presentation. First, preservation, conservation, or restoration. What am I doing? Then we'll talk about the parts of a preservation program. We'll discuss some of the broad benefits, not just of preservation in general, but some of the things that will provide the broadest benefit to your collection. I'll also talk very briefly about the value of taking smaller steps, and then we'll talk about how you make preservation decisions. Again, for clarity, I work primarily with paper-based photographic and audiovisual collections, so really the kinds of things you typically find in an archives, and half of the things you find in historical societies, but many of the preservation concepts apply very broadly across collection types. So let's talk about what preservation is and what it is not. Preservation, or if you're in the museum world, we probably call it preventive conservation, is the set of activities that help us meet the goal of responsible custody for all of our valued materials. So we're thinking about what measures we take to protect these collections as they exist currently. Conservation really falls under the umbrella of preservation, and it involves the examination of individual objects, the formulation of a treatment plan or treatment plans specific to that object, and documentation of any treatment or repair performed in order to stabilize the object so that it can continue to serve its purpose as defined by, your institution. Conservators really look to the American Institute of Conservation's Code of Ethics in making decisions about how to proceed, and they make every effort to perform treatments that can be reversed if need be. So conservation falls under the preservation program, but it is a separate activity with a separate set of professional skills. And I just want to mention, of course, that people often think of preservation, conservation, and restoration all sort of in a row. Um, Restoration is fairly different from the first two. It's the act of bringing an object back to a certain appearance, and this is generally perceived to be, the so-called original appearance. So it may be an activity, performing an activity uh, that changes the object rather than trying to stabilize it or keep it in its current condition. So today we're really talking primarily about preservation and then to a limited extent about conservation. In the last slide, I mentioned the idea of responsible custody, but what does that really mean? Responsible custody describes a level of environmental control, housing, care, and maintenance that will slow further chemical deterioration and also protect materials from physical damage. So, for example, these preventive measures can include climate management, protective enclosures, fire detection and suppression, security procedures, disaster planning, staff training, user training, and many other things. So these are just some examples of the kinds of things that fall under the activities that promote responsible custody. Preservation itself works best when it's programmatic. This means working to manage and plan the policy underpinnings of preservation, but also the individual activities that contribute to a preservation program. So this is doing things like preparing and using a written collection development policy, but also performing discrete activities like rehousing paper-based collections and acid-free folders. That's when we get real nitpicky, right? We're going to go through the many aspects of a preservation program, really following the rubric that we use at NEDCC. We have a fairly standard approach. You can find a document for doing self-assessment. It's assessing your preservation needs, I believe by Beth Patkus, is on our website. So if you were interested in doing a self-assessment, that's a possibility. But these are really the steps that we go through when we come and do an assessment for people. I do want to acknowledge that each aspect, though we're going to examine them individually, can affect or be affected by other parts of the preservation program. So this is the goal is to look holistically at, while examining these individual aspects, understanding that they all come together to form your program, and they influence each other. A thorough awareness and articulation of institutional goals and objectives for the collection as a whole, meaning what the organization wishes to document, who it wishes to serve, and what types of material it will collect to accomplish these goals, provides the underpinning for all preservation actions. This broad understanding provides context to support preservation decision-making, and it really should be made clear in the institution's mission statement and in the set of policies for collections management. So the first aspect that we look at is whether you actually have a mission statement or collection policies. And this is a question you guys should be asking yourself. I suspect many of you do, but if you don't, maybe think about preparing a mission statement. Think about whether the mission statement, as it reflects your collection, does it also explicitly state that preservation is an aspect of your mission? And look at your collection development policies. Do they exist? What do they cover? Are there gaps? One of the gaps that we often find is deaccessioning. So that's going to come up again later. The most basic requirement for successful preservation planning is a local commitment. One indicator of commitment is appropriate staffing and budgeting. Ideally, assigning someone responsibility over preservation management is going to be your goal. So one individual is primarily responsible for managing all preservation programs. And this is easier for some institutions than for others. If you have a paid full-time dedicated staff, then the potential for having a preservation manager, preservation administrator is much higher. But most of us probably have staffing that looks less like this and more like this guy over here. One person who gets to spend a half or a quarter, this is probably more like an eighth, of their time focusing on preservation activities. The smaller your staff, really the more important planning becomes. Planning takes time, but laying the groundwork for a preservation plan as early as possible will guide you to the most effective preservation choices in the context of your institution. One of the big contextual issues for institutions of all sizes is, of course, your budgeting. An effective and comprehensive preservation program, it requires effort and it involves some expense beyond just the expenses of staff time, which is an expense in and of itself. No matter what your budget is, though, you really should work towards establishing a budget line item for preservation. So if you don't have one, start looking into this. It can take time to get it added depending on the type of institution you work for. But one of the beauties of a dedicated budget is that you ensure that day-to-day projects and activities are recognized as part of the larger organizational operations. So you establish local commitment. But also, even if you can only budget a very small amount, it's still worthwhile. Funders tend to look favorably upon organizations that are pursuing preservation and conservation projects but have some money already committed to the work, even if it's only a tiny bit. So ask yourself, if I can't in this fiscal year, if I can't budget in anything at all, maybe in next fiscal year, can I budget in even $100? Some institutions will be able to do that easily. Some will have a little bit more trouble, but any amount is a good amount. Finally, as part of your management and planning, you need to establish some level of intellectual control, right? Like you need to know what you have. This not only helps staff and researchers identify and locate potentially relevant materials, which is really, one of our goals as collecting institutions. It's also inextricably linked to physical control. So these record-keeping activities and shelving practices that ensure that materials are where they are supposed to be. Intellectual control can be achieved through creation of catalogs, creation of inventories, finding aids, other descriptive guides. Even just a rough index of your materials is going to be helpful. And this is because intellectual control doesn't just facilitate access. Good intellectual control supports preservation. It does this by providing documentation of ownership of collection materials, which is really helpful if something is stolen, God forbid. It also supports preservation by preventing damage and disorder caused by people rummaging through large numbers of boxes and documents in archival or historic collections. It helps in maintaining intellectual links between materials that may be physically separated for preservation purposes. So, for example, different formats have different preservation needs, and if you're thinking about a collection that has papers and photographs in it, you may separate out the photographs from the papers, so making sure that there is an intellectual link between these materials is going to help your researchers over time, it's going to help you over time. Finally, it also supports preservation in the context of disaster recovery because it helps staff to see which materials, if any, have been damaged or destroyed. Aside from collections management and planning, we also look at the building and environment for the purposes of preservation planning. A well-maintained building is really your first line of defense for collections. In addition to being your first line of defense, if you happen to be in a historic structure, and I suspect that some of you are, you should or do consider your building the largest collection item that you hold. And because it's a collection item, it requires the same responsible custody that you offer the materials that are housed within. So unless the structure is sound, it can't prevent the entrance of pests and intruders, it can't support climate control, it can't protect records from fire, water, and other disasters. Making sure that you have a sound building is is really integral and is going to serve you in good stead over time. Performing routine maintenance on your building is going to benefit all collections as well as staff and visitors. I was recently at, this is a bit of a tangent, but I was recently at an institution in another region of the country where they had they have many, 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 many years of deferred maintenance on one of their historic structures that also happens to house some of their administration. And two people in sort of the secretarial pool, I don't think that's what they call it, of course, were they had to put a tarp above their heads so because when they would touch the roof in their office, water would seep out. So, you know, we're not just thinking about our collections here, we're also thinking about our staff. They also deserve a good working environment. So you want to be thinking about whether there is a schedule in place for inspection, and also is there a system for recording maintenance needs. You want to inspect your building at least annually, and you also want to inspect any environmental control systems that you have within, if you happen to have some. Not everybody does, of course. Generally, understanding the climate in your area will also help you understand preservation risks. So if you're in DC and it's July, I'm from the DC area, which is why I think of this. But if you're in DC and it's July and you have a collection and you don't have environmental controls, you know that there's going to be some humidity risks. It gets very sticky. That outside environment could wreak havoc on your collections. And if you don't have an HVAC, you probably want to have some kind of dehumidifier on hand. Storage conditions are affected by the integrity of your building and your environmental systems, right? In a storage environment, the temperature, relative humidity, and air quality all play serious roles in determining the lifespan of your collections. Heat and moisture, along with air pollutants, act as catalysts for chemical, mechanical, and biological decay, making the rate at which materials age directly proportional to the conditions in which they're stored. And the conditions in which they're stored are affected by outside conditions as well. Of course, it's not just temperature, relative humidity, and air quality that pose risks. We also look at internal risks related to fire, water, and light exposure, and then we determine got a little tongue-tied. Then we determine methods for mitigation. These can be at various levels, right? So this might mean that you draw the blinds and curtains, or it might mean that you decide to install an LED lighting system. It depends on your level of resources. It might mean ensuring collections are moved away from water pipes, or it might mean installing water alarms in known problem areas. It might mean getting fire extinguishers inspected and also getting staff training in their use. If you're at a historical society, please go check and see if your fire extinguishers have been inspected in the last, 10 years. They should be inspected annually. This is just something that comes up a lot, so I'm going to mention it. Just go and double check and make sure that you have a recently inspected fire extinguisher. It could help you in the long run. One of the best things that you can do in relation to, we're thinking about the temperature relatively, so that both the outside environment and the inside factors. So one of the best things that you can do, and nobody wants to do it, and I realize that, is to prepare for emergencies with a disaster plan for collections based upon your understanding of these risks. Okay, so you don't want to do it, right? Maybe some of you have one. I would be just absolutely so delighted to know that. If you don't have one, you can do some measures in between. At the bare minimum, you can prepare a panic sheet and have some disaster supplies on hand. So you're thinking about what could happen to your collections and preparing for that. These are all suggestions that we make when we're doing assessments, and they come up fairly regularly. Building security as a whole should be considered, along with any storage area protections and reading room practices. You really just want to consider who has access to collection spaces and when. As a hint, um, think about housekeeping and security. I have found that they often have relatively unfettered access to uh, collections areas that they may not be that it may not be appropriate for them to have access to. Um, so consider this in sort of a broad way. We also look at housekeeping and pest management. So who does what, where do they do it, are they supervised or unsupervised doing it? If they're unsupervised, is that really okay? If housekeeping is going into collection storage areas during the evening, which is often the case if they are being allowed to do cleaning in those areas, it does pose a security risk for collections. So keeping that in mind, and also recognizing that again these various aspects can influence each other. So your housekeeping practices, having a chance to monitor them, ensures both the security of your collections and ensures that any activities that they're doing, any cleaning supplies that they're using are appropriate for the area that they're cleaning. We also look at collection storage and handling in both broad and specific ways. This is because collections represent an investment to be maintained in the same way that buildings and equipment are maintained. The most basic element of this maintenance is provision of a safe, appropriate storage and use space. So we're asking ourselves questions like, are materials overcrowded? Are they stacked directly on the floor? Thinking back into the environmental question, is it in an appropriate storage environment? Is there high humidity in the area? Is it stored along an outside wall? These areas can experience different fluctuations in relative humidity that are different from other areas. So are we doing monitoring and making sure that our storage spaces are appropriate? Really, having sufficient storage and workspace promotes safe handling. Ideally, you would have something like, if you're, I'm going to use archival terminology, right? I know it's a little bit different from museums, but if you're processing a collection and you have a collection that just came in and you're preparing it for use, are you sitting in the storage room and processing it? Do you have a processing area outside of the storage room? Ideally, you'd have sort of a processing space within or in close proximity to the collection storage area, and then you'd also have a separate space for patron use, so that this further secures your collection, it further protects them. If you have a space available for storage, a space available for patron access. You also want to think about the shelving and storage furniture that's being used, making sure that it's appropriate in size for the collections that you have, making sure that it provides good support for the materials, and also, if possible, ensuring that you're using furniture that's made from inert materials, so it's not going to off-gas. Recognizing again that some of these there are levels of practice that you can move through, right? So you may not have the resources at this time to purchase all new furniture. So what are some things that you can do instead? And sometimes just knowing that you have a risk is sufficient. It is a step forward. Understanding what's going on is a step forward. All preservation actions are good preservation actions. as I said, that there are broad issues in collection storage handling, and then there are like the very narrow and nitpicky issues. So when we're talking about preparing collections at NEDCC, what we mean is all of these steps that make the collection move from an inaccessible form to a more accessible form. And all the steps that make the collections that help the collections live in a manner that is going to help them last for as long as possible or as long as desired, because those are two different things, right? You may have some items that you want to last forever if possible, but you may also have some items that have a determined lifespan. You only need to have them around for 20 years. So making sure that you can do that responsibly. So this is where we ask questions. We look at specific formats, right? So in our assessments, we look at paper-based materials, bound and unbound. We look at pamphlets and booklets a little bit differently from bound volumes. We look at documents and manuscripts. We look at photographs and negatives. And we look at audiovisual materials, so magnetic media, optical media, and film cylinders, things like this. And we look at each of them separately and say, okay, for this format, what would be the ideal situation, and how do we start moving towards this? Even if we can't meet the ideal right now, what are some steps that we can take? This again is the nitpicky area, right? So this is where we think about, okay, you have a collection, you don't know what's in it, so you're going to process it. Well, do you follow the archival practice of more product, less process, and make a decision that you leave paper clips on, or do you decide to take the paper clips off? And this is where we would talk about, why you might remove paper clips, why you might remove staples, but also why you might not. So if you, in this example, if you have a really good environment, then if the paper clip or staple isn't rusting, you probably can leave it on for now, and think about it later. If you don't have as good of an environment and you have some rusting staples and paper clips, you may choose to get them all off. These are decisions based on the time and resources that you have. But the ultimate goal is to get the collections housed in a way that's appropriate to them, in folders that are appropriate, and in for documents in boxes that are appropriate, for books in custom fitted boxes that are appropriate to them, to make sure that they're protected and safe from, light and water and pests and things like this. And again, you're really thinking about what you have the time and the ability to do. There are things that are realistic, and there are things that are more complicated. And in this, the preparing collections aspect of the assessment, we're often discussing activities that are easiest to peck away at because they involve specific discrete actions. So again, things like pulling staples, things like, placing oversized bound volumes horizontally in stacks no more than 4 high, rather than the more complicated, time-consuming, or expensive tasks. So things like working towards a building renovation that includes consolidated and environmentally controlled storage spaces. This is, I think, an integral and very important part of the assessment, because it provides specific activities that can be done with often with relatively low effort, and and they can give a feeling of success as you build towards larger activities. So while they are nitpicky and they don't provide like the hugest benefit to all of your collections, they may have value to your institution in just moving forward with some preservation practices and saying, you know, we've done that, we've ticked it off, we have this thing, we do it, we make sure that all of our books are shelved appropriately and are standing upright and have nice non-knifing bookends to hold them up. And you can feel good and proud because it is a preservation action. But it's also it also needs to be considered in light of some of the larger activities that you need to do to protect all collections. We also talk about handling policies and practices, and so this would be things that, again, having written documentation that says, in our institution, we do this, and this can be, so in this example, we have, you know, we wear gloves when we work with photographs or negatives, and we only use pencils. And this, the handling policies and practices, having documentation there is really helpful, not just because it, you know, often we think about this for researchers, right? We think, oh, this is for the researcher so that they understand what we expect from them. Very important that we have clear expectations of our researchers. On the other hand, this is also a document, especially if you work at an institution that has a smaller staff or a largely volunteer staff. This is kind of a fundamental document in making sure that if you have staff changes or if you have some staff that's more aware of preservation concerns than others, that there's a document that they can go to and say, okay, I see what some of our basic principles are. Here at our institution, we believe this and we do it this way. And then they can relay that on to researchers as they come in. And with that, we come back to conservation treatment. So conservation, reformatting, and exhibition we think about all together because often an institution, most institutions at some point will participate in one or more of these activities, and often they will do them with some outside involvement from possibly a vendor, a consultant, things like this. An outside conservator possibly. So the first thing I want to say is, unless you're a conservator, please do not attempt to treat any materials of lasting value. It's easy to do more harm than good. So if you're thinking of doing anything to an object, at the very least have a conversation with a conservator beforehand. Just better safe than sorry. Conservation really requires us to ask, what is the value of this object to the collection? What purpose would conservation serve? Is this the most appropriate time to have this conserved? And one of the things we're thinking about here is, okay, conservation isn't cheap, right? You're spending a lot of money, very validly. If you're conserving something, the assumption is that it has some significant value to your institution, to your collection, possibly to your local area, your region, the nation, the world. These are all possibilities. But it's not, you know, it's not an inexpensive proposition in times and in organizations that are financially constrained. There are things that you can do that benefit all collections, like ensuring that your building is maintained, rather than things that benefit only one item. And really, if your building isn't maintained, if your environment isn't in good shape, so you've been having mold blooms, sending something out for conservation and then, or having it conserved in-house, although I'm imagining it more sending it out kind of situation, you're taking something, getting it stabilized, and then putting it back into a situation that's not great for it. So these are things to consider as you're thinking about this. If you do decide to get something conserved, you want to think about, what is your expected use for the item? How do you convey that use to a conservator? And make sure that they know, what you plan to do with it, what your goals are. Selection for reformatting is coming up even more and more, right? We all want to digitize. We all have, to a certain extent, pressures to digitize our collections. Selection for reformatting needs to be grounded in your collections policies. So again, we go back to the idea that you need to have a collection development policy that guides you in making these decisions, so that you're making them as responsibly and as efficiently, as effectively as you can. But beyond the policy underpinnings, there are also physical preservation concerns that drive the decision of what to digitize and when. So as with conservation, we're asking ourselves, what is the value of this object? What are my goals for it? Like, why am I doing this? Why am I digitizing it? If I'm digitizing for preservation purposes, for example, am I prepared to take on stewardship of the digital object as well as the original object? Because if we're digitizing solely for access, then we have different expectations of stewardship of the digital materials that you create. But if you're digitizing something for preservation, and in particular here, I'm thinking of things like, sorry guys, I think you can hear that, and I don't know how to turn it off. But if you're digitizing for preservation, so you're digitizing an audio collection, a video collection, maybe a motion picture collection, but largely like magnetic media, things that are on obsolete carriers, you are, by digitizing, making a preservation copy, and that may be the only viable copy. So you're deciding whether you're stewarding both objects, the physical object and the digital object, and what level of stewardship commitment you can make to the digital object. Do you have a plan for digital preservation? This question's coming up a lot. It's time to start thinking about it if you haven't already. I bet you have, but if you haven't, be ready. It's something that we are thinking about a lot here, actually, because it poses particular concerns, and it can, in essence, double your collections and the amount of material that you need to steward. And then we're also thinking about exhibition. When we're thinking about how people or how your institutions make exhibition choices, we want to ask ourselves the questions: how long will the object be on display? Is the object stable enough to withstand exhibition without additional stabilization? And also, can it withstand the light exposure? Do we have records of the object's exhibit history and past light exposure? Will the object be secure in the building and within its case or frame? Do we have appropriate climate control abilities for this particular item? And do we have appropriate supports and mounts, or can we produce them? So these are many of the questions that we ask. A lot of questions, essentially. You go in, you take a look at your building and your practices and your collections with as fresh eyes as you can, and sort of ask yourself a bunch of questions in order to identify what your needs and goals are. The things that I feel strongly provide the broadest benefits, and by this I mean benefits to all collection materials, regardless of format and regardless of current condition, are routine building inspection and maintenance. If you're not maintaining your building, then you're putting all of your collections at risk. this includes review of environmental systems, but really making sure your building's in good shape. You're cleaning your gutters. Leaks are fixed in a expeditious manner. Things like this, they're going to have long-term value, and they're going to keep your collections as safe as you can. I also strongly believe that providing continuing education or professional development for your staff, anyone involved in collections care, and this can be done at relatively low cost, right? I mean, it could involve reading uh, preservation leaflets or the conservation notes from Canadian Conservation Institute. It can be done at a more invested level by making sure that you have funds for ongoing professional development. And one of the benefits of funded professional development is that it can allow staff members to participate in local, regional, and national conversations about collections care, which should be a goal for anyone involved in managing preservation. Having access to a network of peers it's becoming more and more clear to me that the network that we have when we're working in preservation is how we move forward, and how we figure out how to deal with particulars of our institution, actually, because even if you are very unusual in terms of your institutional size or scope, there will be an institution that's similar, that's facing similar problems, that has come up with novel solutions. So, the education portion of it, I can't stress enough. I've had some really good experiences with people who have no professional training in preservation, but know where to ask questions and are able to move forward and be good advocates because they are invested in learning. And finally, it's not NEDCC if we don't say policy. So having documented policies in place is going to not just guide your existing staff on procedures, you're actually, there's there's a meme going around about how metadata is a love note to the future, which is lovely. I think you could say that policy is, a kind of a boring love note to the future, but still it's a love note to the future. You're saying, here's what we established as the parameters for what we do in our institution. We've invested in the time to plan and to make priorities and to identify goals and see what resources we have to do these things. Writing them down is really important and doesn't happen as often as one might hope. So, oh, and the other part of the policy thing is deaccessioning. I think deaccessioning has really broad benefits to your collections. I know we get squeamish about it as professionals, but having an explicit policy for either not accepting materials into your collection, which is also really good, is to be able to say, no, we don't accept these kinds of things because we can't steward them or because they don't fit our scope. But also having a statement that says, here are our practices, here's how we make decisions about our existing collections and how we deaccession them. Making sure that we are only collecting the materials that are most appropriate to our mission and our audience. Ensures that our resources are used as effectively as they can be. We aren't stewarding things that aren't furthering that goal. Okay, so there are broad goals, right? There are big, grand things that we can do. We can start an integrated pest management program, which is one of the things that I really enjoy talking about, but nobody else does. So we can do programmatic activities that require an investment of time and development of knowledge in some instances, pest management, environmental monitoring, things like these. But again, any preservation activity is a good activity, and doing something is better than doing nothing. And I think we can get caught up in the idea that, there's this best practice and there's a high standard that we need to meet. But if your resources don't allow you to approach the 5-star top of the mountain standard, see if you can approach the slightly smaller mountain, and move forward a little bit. Again, pulling down the blinds, having a cache of disaster supplies available. Anything that furthers the life of your collections is worthwhile. I was just at an institution very small, with no actual staffing and no actual funding, and in a barn without climate control, very little security, only has people on site for about 3 months out of the year. And they were pulling their materials out of plastic bags, and random cardboard boxes, loose stacks, and placing them into archival boxes and folders, and not even doing a high level of processing, but just getting things off the floor, getting them in boxes. And I could not have been more delighted by the progress that they were making, because by taking this small action, putting things in boxes, they were helping to protect against light. They were helping to protect against pollutants. They were helping to protect against this at least one pesky mouse that appears to live in the collection. So they've done a relatively small action that helps all of the collections and moves them forward with some larger preservation goals. So yeah, don't let the perfect be the enemy of the good. Pluck the low-hanging fruit. All these these phrases that we have for doing a little bit is worthwhile, and doing the easy stuff is worthwhile as well. How do you make the decisions, right? Okay, so you need to assess your needs. That's why you would go through a preservation assessment, either internally or through a consultant. Identify your resources, start to marshal them, think about what your goals are, determine what your priorities are, and this is determined in light of what your actual capabilities are, and then make a plan. Like your ultimate need is to move from identifying where you have problems and making a plan to address those problems over 3 or 5 or 10 years. But also, think about doing some of the easy things now. It can make you, it can give a feeling of progress, because it is progress. And it can be very satisfying to see that something is done, even if you know that you have these larger activities that need to be done. And one way of thinking about this is once you've identified all of your needs, is to use an impact and feasibility grid and just lay them out. Think about your resources. Think about whether this activity is high impact and high feasibility, in which case, man, go for it. If it's low impact and low feasibility, maybe you don't do it now, maybe you don't do it ever. But the grid can be very helpful in laying out and figuring out what actually is possible for your institution and what to start pecking away at right now. So there we go. I'm going to scoot forward real quickly just to say I got all of my images from the Noun project. These are the people who produced them. If you do have any questions, I'm more than happy to answer them. I hope this was clear and useful. We do even internally, we sometimes get a little, when we're trying to talk about preservation assessments, we're like, well, does this fit more in handling policies or does it fit more in this other section? Should I talk about this in security or should I talk about this over here? Because it is also intertwined. So if anybody has any questions about preservation or NEDCC or anything, I'll do my best to answer them. And also, that's fantastic. Sorry.
Sorry. No, if you guys do have any questions, go ahead and type them in the chat feature, and Jessica can answer them. Or she's also available by email. She obviously put it there, so.
I think that's really great that I actually didn't realize NEMA had a document exchange, which is now going to be one of my go-to resources, because that's what we come across a lot is people think, I can't do this thing, and really it's it's there. They just need to, tweak it a little bit.
Yep, that's actually one of our member benefits is the document exchange. This summer we're looking at updating it, and actually our next issue of the journal is going to be on collections. So we're definitely going to be looking at more collection plans and stuff like that. So we're definitely looking at beefing up that particular section this summer. So that's something to check out. You don't need to reinvent the wheel if someone's already created something. Just take a look at it, see what you like out of it and stuff like that. We're also going to be doing a survey to go along with the journal, so everybody will get an email about that that's a member and stuff. And as Meg just put there. And also I want to give a little shout out to the Connecting to Collections website. That's also really good, useful information for like free webinars and stuff like that. We're collaborating with them in August for our Lunch with NEMA there. So that's another good one that we're looking at and stuff like that. So that's something to think about. And we also have a former Lunch with NEMA that was on pest management. So if you want to go through all the creepy crawly things, that's available on our website to view too. Yep.
And what is the collections benchmarking survey?
We're actually just going to be doing a survey on like collection care, just a bunch of different questions that we've come up with, and we're going to be submitting that to the membership, and then after that we'll be writing an article for the journal.
Oh, interesting.
So if you have any suggestions you want to see on there, let me know. It's actually a really quiet group today. So do you guys have any continued questions for Jessica while we have her on the line? I think you've covered a lot.
Oh, no.
Okay, you maybe just at the top of the iceberg, but you made it look easy.
Well, yeah, and I am available. I know that sometimes people don't want to. I know that I, in webinars, do not chime in. So I'm available by email or by phone. We also, I just have to say this, we have a 24-hour emergency hotline. If you have a collections emergency, and emergency is defined however you choose to define it, you can call and you'll be answered by either myself or one of our preservation specialists, and they'll help you work through next steps.
And I should also mention that this was recorded today, so if you want to rewatch it or have someone else watch it, it will be available on the NEMA website later this afternoon.
Well, thank you all again so much for... Oh, I see typing, yeah. But yeah, thank you all for the time and for listening to me talk about preservation. I really, and I appreciate the opportunity from NEMA as well. That was very kind of you all to take me on.
It was great that you were that you're available to talk, because I know this is definitely something that you're very much interested in. So it's always good for people to share their knowledge with everybody else. So I just want to say thank you to Jessica, and thank you to everybody that came today, and I hope to see you next month. Thanks.
Thank you.